Okay, welcome everybody. I think we can begin. It is 2 minutes past 10. I'd just like to start by giving my apologies. Thanks to the joy of ESCOM, I will be hosting this call on my telephone. I would have loved to see all of you, but thank you anyway for joining. So colleagues, today is the first in a series of webinars. These webinars are intended to take place every Thursday at 10 a.m. It's a space for engagement with the various trial leadership as well as civil society. So firstly, welcome from us. Thank you, Prof. Madhi, for making the time to engage with us. We always make a note of this engagement with trial leadership, as engagement does seem to be increasingly the exception rather than the norm during these times of COVID-19. And so this webinar series every Thursday for the next 12 months is our collective attempt to open up the space, break down the exclusivity of research and ensure that a critical mass of civil society and communities have their voices heard in the discussion around research which happens on our home ground. Colleagues, I'll just give a brief introduction to our guest today. Shabir Madhi is a professor of vaccinology at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and co-founder and co-director of the African Leadership Initiative for Vaccinology Enterprise Alive. Professor Madhi completed his undergraduate and postgraduate training at the University of the Witwatersrand, qualifying as a pediatrician in 1996 and obtaining his PhD in 2003. He currently also holds the positions of Director of the South African Medical Research Council, Respiratory and Meningeal Pathogens Research Unit, and is the Research Chair in Vaccine Preventable Diseases of the Department of Science and Technology and the National Research Foundation. His full biography, colleagues, will be included in the report that we will circulate to all participants after this call. A brief overview of who is hosting the call and putting the call together. My name is Tian Johnson. I am a member of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, also known as the VAG, as well as the founder of the African Alliance. Both of those entities are hosting this call today with the support and partnership of APHA and the Community Constituency COVID-19 Front. I'd like to take a moment now to recognize the SAMRC and the Department of Science and Innovation for supporting the work of the Alliance. Also recognition to yourself, Prof, and your team, Karishma and Claire, for being immediately open to engage and working together with us to develop community and advocacy materials related to the trial. And we look forward to your ongoing support, transparency, and accountability to communities. Also, congratulations on the scientists who have come forward to participate in the trial, Dr. June Fabian, Francois Fenter, Martin Feller. I think this is symbolically important because it begins to help us chip away at the anti-research and anti-vaxxer messaging that we're all working daily to counter. So I think that's just an overview. Colleagues, the way the call is structured is Shabir will give us an overview of the trial and some contextual remarks for the next 20 minutes. And at 10:26, we will immediately go into the questions that have been submitted by yourselves as civil society, as well as the questions we received from our various social media platforms on Twitter and on Facebook. So without wasting any further time, Prof. Madhi, over to you.
So thanks, Tian, and good morning, everyone. So I just need the host to help me to allow me to share the screen. On your side, you need to. So Tian, I'm not too sure if you're hosting the call, but whoever is hosting the call, they need to just go to that icon, the share screen. And
perfect, just give me a sec.
My apologies for the delay. I'm just still trying to get my screen on.
No worries, Shabir. Shabir, I think we're just having some issues. In the interest of time, if you're able to speak to the slides, I'm also just recognizing that not everyone is joining on a computer. So I think the majority won't be able to see the screen. But in the meantime, I'm happy for you to go ahead and speak through the slides. We'll ensure that everyone also gets those slides, just while we're trying to sort out
Are you able to see my
sharing.
slide now?
No.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll speak to it and hopefully it can come up. It might be a bit difficult to get to it, but let me speak to it. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thanks.
Oh, there you go, Shabir. I've allowed you to share your screen, apparently. Okay, so it should work now.
Are you able? Are people able to see my slides now?
No, not yet.
Ah, there you go. We can see the slides now.
Okay, perfect.
We can see the slides now.
Okay. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to do over the course of the next 20 minutes is really try to raise the issues in terms of why it's so important for COVID vaccine studies, not just to be done in South Africa, but also in Africa more generally. And I think a good starting point is just a reality check. And that is Africa makes up about 17–18% of the global population. And of all clinical trials that were done in the past 10–15-year period, only 2.5% of clinical trials have actually been done in Africa, on the African continent. And most of those clinical trials are trials that are usually related to HIV, TB, and malaria. So what that effectively results in is that many life-saving therapeutics, as well as vaccines, the time in which it actually becomes available on the African continent, there's anything between a 5 to 20-year lag between the time when it becomes available in Africa compared to when it becomes available in many high-income countries, including for life-saving vaccines. And that has been the legacy of many vaccines over the past 25 years when I've been working in this field. Now, one of the issues that's been raised is that Africa is actually being somewhat spared disease from COVID-19. And this is sort of a graphic in terms of the total number of cases. And as we know, we're reaching the 13 million mark now. And less than 5% of those cases are actually being reported on the African continent. So it's either that Africa is really being spared or there's something else that's seriously wrong. And the short answer to that, unfortunately, is that there is something seriously wrong. Of the over 500,000 cases that are now reported from Africa, about more than half of those cases are reported from a single country, and that is South Africa. And the reason for that is that besides from Mauritius, South Africa does the highest amount of testing per capita. So in South Africa, we're doing roughly about just under 40 tests per 1,000 of the population. And that sort of is very much lower, about 5 to 8-fold lower than the amount of testing that's being done in many other high-income countries, including in the United States, as an example. They're testing at 120 per 1,000. In many European countries, they're testing at about 200 per 1,000. Now, the amount of testing you do completely sort of determines the amount of cases that you're going to eventually identify. So even though South Africa is performing reasonably well on the African continent, we're still lagging behind. And even in the United States, where they're testing at 120 per 1,000, the estimate is that the United States doesn't have 2.5 million cases as being reported, but rather they got 7 times more cases of people that have been infected with the virus than what is actually reported. In South Africa, it's no different. When we're talking of 300,000 people having been infected with the virus, those are the 300,000 people that are known to be infected. The true number of people that are actually infected is probably at least 7 to 10 times greater than that. So the total number of South Africans that have been infected right now is closer to probably about 2.1 million rather than 300,000 people. Now, what you see is that Nigeria, which has got a population about 4 times bigger than South Africa, reports 1/10 of the number of cases compared to South Africa, 1/10. Despite them having a population 4 times bigger than South Africa. And the reason for that is that the testing rate for infection in Nigeria is 0.5 per thousand compared to about 40 per thousand in South Africa. So it's really difficult to understand what's happening on the African continent, but safe to say that our past experiences, including in 2009 with the swine flu, is that the significant underestimate in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the African continent. Now, where are we in South Africa in terms of the epidemic? Unlike many Northern Hemisphere countries that have started to have a wane in terms of the outbreak, and this is what we call a 3-day average. So every 3 days, what's the additional number of new cases that are actually diagnosed? As you can see, even in Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, when they were at the peak of their outbreak, the total number of the 3-day average in terms of new number of cases that were diagnosed was ranging between 6,000 to 8,000. Now, they were only testing hospitalized cases, so you can't make direct comparisons between these sort of plots. But what we're seeing in South Africa is that with us not yet having peaked in terms of the epidemic, we're already seeing 12,000 cases being diagnosed each day with a 3-day rolling average. So we haven't yet peaked, and this number is going to continue increasing. There's no telling when we're going to peak. The modeling indicates that we probably will peak around about the end of August. The Western Cape probably has already peaked. Gauteng will probably peak in about 2 to 3 weeks, and other provinces will probably follow suit in the near future. Now, another big unknown is the true number of people that have actually died from COVID-19. So this is an analysis by the South African Medical Research Council as of the 7th of July. So by the 7th of July, what the MRC estimated is that there were about 11,000 people that had died over and above what was expected for this time of the year since the 6th of May, 11,000 people. On the same day, the number of people that were attributed to have died from COVID-19, these were diagnosed cases, was 3,600. So there's 3 times more people that have actually died over and above what should have occurred this time of the year than the number of people that have been reported as deaths from COVID-19. And that means one of 2 things. It means that we are either underdiagnosing deaths from COVID-19 or that people are actually dying because of the impact of the interventions that we're putting against COVID-19 and the negative impact it's having on other health indices, including, as an example, people being less likely to be treated for tuberculosis or coming forward to be investigated for tuberculosis. So we've got a big problem. In fact, total number of people that are dying right now is 3 times higher than the number of people that are being, the number of deaths that are being attributed to COVID-19. What we see at the provincial level is that in the Western Cape, as an example, they reported 2,200 deaths on the 7th of July from COVID-19. The excess mortality in the Western Cape at the same time was 3,700. But what you're seeing happening in the Western Cape, there's sort of a plateauing off in terms of that excess mortality over the past 3-4 weeks, which indicates the Western Cape probably is plateauing in terms of where it is at the peak of the epidemic. And it will take it maybe 2-3 more weeks before this hopefully starts coming down. In Gauteng, what we're seeing, on the 7th of July, when the province was reporting about 480 COVID deaths, the excess mortality was about 7 times higher than that, 2,800. So there's a huge discrepancy between the number of people that are actually dying and the number of deaths that are being reported for COVID-19. The KZN most recently are also starting to show an excess in terms of mortality over and above what is expected for this time of the year. And the Eastern Cape, unfortunately, is completely out of control in terms of where they're heading with this particular outbreak. So why do we need a COVID-19? Now, the reality is that this pandemic is not going away at the end of September, October of 2020. It's not going away at the end of this year. In all likelihood, what we're experiencing right now is we went into a lockdown. There was sort of some dampening of the spread of the virus. We came out of the lockdown, and then this community transmission, and then we get this rebound phenomena. And it's impossible to remain under a level 5 lockdown indefinitely until a vaccine becomes available. So there's no other option. What we're going to experience is that over the next 2 to 3 years, we're probably going to continue having multiple waves of outbreaks of COVID-19. So this is really the first wave of multiple waves. And the additional waves, the magnitude of those additional outbreaks will largely depend on whether natural infection confers an immunity, which we don't think actually happens, or it's at least not durable. And then it also depends on the behavior of citizens in terms of how they adhere to these non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that really is going to determine just how bad the next few waves are going to be. But at the end of the day, most scientists, epidemiologists now agree that in the absence of a vaccine, we're looking at having multiple waves of outbreaks, at least right into 2022. So where are we with vaccines? Globally right now, there's close to 170 vaccines that are under development. And there's different stages of development. There's what we call preclinical development, which is sort of before it goes into human studies, where in non-human primates and mice, you try to show the immunogenicity of the vaccine, how well the vaccine works in inducing antibody and by the immune system, as an example, as well as in non-human primates, whether when they're given a vaccine, if you challenge them with the virus, are they actually protected against COVID-19? So that is the preclinical phase of development. And then you go into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Currently, there are 3 vaccines that are in phase 3. Now, of all of these 170 vaccines and all these 12 vaccines that are currently in phase 2 and phase 3 will be highly successful if even 2 out of those 12 vaccines eventually work. So the success rate in terms of vaccine development from the time it goes into human studies is only 10%. So only 1 out of 10 vaccines that go into human studies will eventually be shown to be safe, as well as to be shown to actually protect against disease for which they're designed. So even though we've got 12 vaccines in phase 2 and phase 3 studies, it doesn't mean we're going to have 12 vaccines that are going to be available in the next 12 months. In fact, if we have 2 of these 12 vaccines that become available in the next 12 months, that itself will be a remarkable achievement. And that raises the issue in terms of who's going to produce these vaccines at large enough quantities for it to become available globally. So I'm not going to go into this, but just some basic issues. So preclinical testing, like I said, is in animals, and those studies are done before we enter into human studies, including the vaccine that we're evaluating in South Africa. The studies were done in non-human primates. It was shown to be safe in non-human primates, and it actually showed that it protected macaque monkeys against developing COVID-19 after they were vaccinated and given a challenge of the virus. But when we do the studies in humans, we do not artificially expose them to the virus. This is something that happens naturally. And unfortunately, whether they study participants or not, they're going to get exposed to these viruses, especially because this is a respiratory virus. There's a probable element of airborne transmission, which makes it extremely difficult to be able to protect oneself from becoming infected. So when we go into clinical studies, then there's phase 1 where we look at small number of people, where we just look at the safety and the best dose to use. Phase 2 starts including a few hundred people to get a better understanding in terms of the selected dose and how well the body's immune system responds to it. And then phase 3 is where we start looking at enrolling thousands of individuals, really to see both for safety, less common sort of side effects that might occur, which you're unable to identify in the early phases of evaluation. But importantly, at this phase, we're also trying to determine whether the vaccine actually protects against COVID-19 or not. So this is just a different representation of the same. Now, the thing about COVID-19 vaccines is it's a different sort of technologies that are being used to develop a vaccine. The technology the vaccine that we're currently evaluating that was used is what we call a non-replicating viral vector, and I'll explain it to you in the next slide. Now, this is the same technology that was used to actually develop the Ebola vaccine that was deployed in West Africa, as well as more recently in the DRC. So they use a different virus vector, but the Ebola vaccine that was deployed that brought the Ebola outbreak to an end is essentially a viral vector vaccine. There aren't many other viral vector vaccines. Most other vaccines are usually these protein-based vaccines or inactivated or weakened virus vaccines. There are some people that are developing SARS coronavirus vaccines using the virus itself by weakening it, but that's not the vaccine that we're evaluating in South Africa. And then there are the nucleic acid vaccines, which are currently being evaluated in Germany, as well as in the United States. Those studies are not being done in South Africa. So how does this vaccine work? We call it a non-replicating viral vaccine. So what's been done is that they've taken an adenovirus, and the specific adenovirus is a chimpanzee adenovirus. It doesn't cause illness in humans, and generally adenoviruses in humans cause extremely mild illness. It causes like a common flu, and most people have already been infected multiple times with these adenoviruses, but not the specific adenovirus used in this particular vaccine construct. That virus is genetically engineered such that it is unable to subsequently replicate. So that's the first step. It basically takes out the ability of this virus to replicate, so it won't be able to cause disease in the body. Now, once having done that, what they do is that they take the genetic material that codes for what is known as a spike protein, which is found on the surface of this virus. That genetic material is inserted into this adenovirus. So when that virus is now injected into a person, this non-replicating virus is used as a vaccine, is injected into a person, that genetic material then allows the body's cells to start producing those proteins. It doesn't produce a virus. It can't produce a virus. It can only produce those proteins. Those proteins then are expressed to or presented to the immune system, and the immune system then starts developing antibodies to that. Now, these antibodies is really what the vaccine is all about. Once you've got these antibodies, what you're able to do is that if you are exposed to the virus, these antibodies attach to the part of the virus which is responsible for attaching to the human cell. So that sort of interrupts or impedes the ability of the virus to gain traction in terms of adhering to the human cell. Or these antibodies can sort of cause clumping of these viruses, again, making it less efficient for the virus to actually adhere to the human cell. Or these antibodies might actually assist in terms of the killing of the virus. And that's how these vaccines work in general. And all of the vaccines are really geared towards achieving the same goal, and that is to produce this sort of functional antibodies that prevents the virus from infecting a person, or at the least, destroys the virus and prevents the virus from causing severe disease. So the study that we're doing, this particular vaccine was developed by the Jenner Institute in the United Kingdom. And I have to declare that the United Kingdom, the investigators there did not approach me to do the study in South Africa. I'm the one that approached them. And because I've known the principal investigator in the United Kingdom for over 25 years, I approached them to see if they would be keen to at least provide us with a vaccine to do a study in South Africa. They were prepared to do that, but they indicated that I would need to basically run the study as well as find the funding to be able to do the study in South Africa, because they didn't have funding for the study. This is before the University of Oxford went into a partnership with AstraZeneca, who has now taken over the IP rights to the vaccine. So these discussions took place before then. Already underway in the United Kingdom is a study where they're enrolling 10,000 participants. They've already enrolled 8,000 participants. And then in addition to the South African study where we're enrolling 2,000 participants, there's another study that has already started in Brazil that is enrolling 5,000 participants. They've already enrolled 1,000 of those 5,000. And the same vaccine is going to be evaluated in the next few weeks. A study will start in the United States where they'll enroll 30,000 participants. Now, the main message here is that in the absence of me reaching out to the investigators in the United Kingdom, there's no COVID vaccine study that would be done on the African continent right now, because there's little interest on the part of pharmaceutical companies to come to Africa when they can get all of these studies done in high-income countries. So that is the reality that we need to face up to. So we actually need to compete to be able to do more studies, not less studies on the African continent, if we are wanting to be adequately equipped in terms of determining how well these vaccines work in our local context. Now, the vaccine study has gone through multiple reviews, including by the Ethics Committee at the University of Witwatersrand, by SAPRA, by the Ethics Committee at Oxford University, as well as because it's a genetically modified product, it also needed approval from DEF, and that itself lent itself to public comment. And the public sent in comments over a 30-day period, which we needed to respond to before DEF basically provided that approval. So all of these boxes have been checked, and it's undergone the necessary ethical review as well as regulatory review before we got started with the study. In addition to which, currently we're enrolling at 3 sites in Gauteng. Each of those sites have engaged with community advisory boards at their sites, and we're planning to expand to 2 sites in the Western Cape, hopefully this coming week. So in the study, what we've got is we've got 3 groups. The first group is what the phase 1 group, a small group of 50 individuals that are not infected with HIV. They will get 2 doses of the vaccine. And this is to tell us whether 1 or 2 doses should be used in the larger group, where we're basically going to look at what we call the efficacy, whether the vaccine actually protects against COVID-19 or not. And right now we're planning 1 dose, but we might need to have 2 doses, depending on the results that come out from the United Kingdom, which will be published on Monday, from their phase 1 study, as well as partly related to the findings from our study. Now, in addition to that, we've got another group of people with HIV, which we've limited to 50 individuals for a number of reasons. But by doing the study, we will be able to determine how well they respond to the vaccine. And by using the data from the immune responses in the people without the HIV, as well as efficacy data, we'll be able to make some sort of extrapolation as to whether the vaccine would also work in people with HIV in South Africa. Who's eligible for participation? Anyone that's basically able to understand what the study is all about, people between the age of 18 and 65 specifically. We base all of the people, all of the volunteers are actually subjected to an assessment of understanding before they're actually allowed to participate in the study. And they need to score at least 80% on that questionnaire, or else they wouldn't be eligible to participate in the study. And then we're also including people with comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes as an example, provided that they adequately manage and they're under control. So I'm not going to go too much in terms of the exclusion criteria. It pretty much is covered with the inclusion criteria. So now one of the big problems that we face, one of the possible benefits of vaccination is firstly, we hope to confer direct immunity. But there are situations where people that are at high risk of developing severe disease, they might not respond well to the vaccine. A way in which a vaccine can actually protect those individuals that might not respond well to a vaccine, as an example, the elderly or people that are highly immunocompromised, is by achieving what we call herd immunity. Now, what herd immunity is that once a significant percentage of the population develops immunity against an organism, that organism becomes less efficient in terms of transmitting between people. For SARS coronavirus, the estimate is that we need to get at least 40% of the population immune against the virus, and then we'll be able to interrupt the transmission of the virus in the community. So the virus will still continue circulating, but the risk of people becoming infected will be greatly diminished. And consequently, even those people that aren't able to derive a direct benefit from the vaccine because they have the impaired immune response to the vaccine, they will indirectly be protected. So that is herd immunity. So this is another huge advantage of vaccines, in that you don't need to vaccinate the entire population to protect most of the population. You can get, for this virus, you can get away with just immunizing 50 to 60% of the population, and you might be able to reach that level that's required for herd immunity. So we started enrolling into study on the 21st of June. We're hoping to complete enrollment of the 2,000 participants by the middle of August. Currently, we're roughly just under 300 participants that have been enrolled. We've had a number of changes to the protocol because of some really, really concerning events with regard to the high number of people in South Africa that are actually infected right now. When the volunteers were coming to the sites, we needed to test them for the virus before we could get them into the study to make sure that they weren't already infected. And we found that between 15 to 20% of people that are completely well are actually walking around with the virus. And that resulted in us needing to recalibrate who we actually target and who we're excluding from the study. So each participant that enters under the study will be followed up for 12 months, both for safety as well as to determine whether they're protected against COVID-19. This is a randomized control trial, which means that when participants come on, they're assigned to one of two groups. One group receives the vaccine, the other group receives a controlled substance, which doesn't do any harm, neither does it does any good. And that allocation is done randomly. So neither the participants nor the investigators would know who received what. And that's absolutely important to us so that it doesn't bias our sort of assessment in terms of whether this vaccine is working or not. So eventually, when there's 42 participants that have developed COVID-19, at least 14 days after they received their first dose of vaccine, at that stage, we'll be able to actually unblind ourselves and do an analysis to determine whether this vaccine protects against COVID-19 or not. The study is reviewed together with a study from the United Kingdom and Brazil by an independent data and safety management committee. And that committee meets every 2 weeks and goes through all of the adverse events, serious adverse events that might occur in the study. And they've got the prerogative to bring the study to a halt if there's any concerns on their part that there might be something wrong going wrong in any of the studies. So even if something happens in the United Kingdom, it would basically impact on all of the studies in terms of what needs to be done. If there's an adverse event in the United Kingdom, which is of concern, and they ask the study to stop in the United Kingdom, that will apply equally across all of the other sites where this particular vaccine is being evaluated.
1 minute, Shabir.
Yep. Hello. So this is my last slide. So basically, like I said, there's been some issues that were raised, and there was a little small protest that occurred in Johannesburg about 2 weeks ago. There were about 20 people that came to that march. When they were interviewed, there were roughly about 20 different reasons why they were there. And much of that emanated because of some very misguided comments by the French scientists a few months ago, indicating that the BCG vaccine trials, and there was a suggestion that BCG vaccination might protect against COVID-19, that those sort of studies should happen in Africa. And obviously there was a lot of negative media around that, correctly so. So we've been enrolling, and as Tian mentioned, as of just yesterday or day before yesterday, we had some of our senior scientists as well as the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Health Sciences at the University of Witwatersrand that actually enrolled into the study. So thanks and apologies for perhaps going over. For those of you that might be interested in getting more information or volunteering, that is the email address where you can direct your queries and someone will get back to you. Over, thanks.
Thank you so much, Shabir. Great presentation. I think you've preempted and also answered quite a few of the questions that we had already pre-submitted. So colleagues, as agreed, we are going to go into the pre-submitted questions before we take the questions that have been submitted now in the chat box. A commitment from us is that if your question is not, if we don't get to your question during this call, we will commit to get to it and get a detailed answer from Shabir and his team as part of the report that follows this call. So Shabir, just getting straight onto it, I think we've all been exposed to a lot of headlines, and I really want to get just your high-level comments behind those headlines. So the issue of once you reach 42 cases, or once 42 cases of COVID-19 have been identified in participants, you will then unblind the study and analyze the data. How long do you anticipate it will take for us to get to that magical number of 42?
Yeah. So it largely depends on how widespread the circulation of the virus is, because if people are exposed to it more intensely over a shorter period of time, those cases will accrue over a shorter period of time. We were thinking that we would need to go into 2021 before we get that sort of an answer. But in terms of the amount of infection, unfortunately, that's taking place in South Africa right now, my estimate is we probably will get an answer as early as the end of November 2020. So I think in the next 4 months, we probably will get an answer as to whether this vaccine works or not.
Thank you. Shabir, could you take us very briefly through the broad funding mechanism of this trial? Who's putting money in? Where are they from? What level of investment are these folks making?
So the only source of funding for this, so the University of Oxford is providing us the vaccine at no cost. So they provide us a vaccine, and that was our agreement with them. And then the funders of the study is South African Medical Research Council and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I'm the one that needed to approach the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We needed to put in an application for funding. So they didn't volunteer to fund us. And the same thing goes for the South African Medical Research Council. It's after I managed to get University of Oxford to agree to at least provide us vaccine, and they indicated that I would need to look for funding, that I sort of went around looking for funding. There were other groups that we actually approached as well for funding, including DFID, including a number of different embassies where we had a call with them. But the ones that we were successful in terms of them agreeing to fund was Gates Foundation as well as the MRC.
Are you able to share the level of that funding?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to hide it. It's in the public domain. So the MRC is basically, the MRC and Department of Science and Technology have been able to raise 10 million. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have basically awarded us 130 million rands. Usually these studies are much more expensive than what I'm actually indicating. So we've needed to really scale back on a number of components. And we're doing the study pretty much just to get the sites to be able to afford to take it on. So there's absolutely no profit that's being derived from any of the sites in terms of their participation on the study.
Thank you. So you mentioned that AstraZeneca took over the IP rights to the vaccine at the outset of the research. Could you speak more to what is the exact nature of AstraZeneca's involvement in this trial? And then as a follow-up to that question, what commitments, if any, has AstraZeneca made to the trial leadership and the governments of countries where this trial is happening?
So the AstraZeneca, the agreement between University of Oxford and AstraZeneca followed after my agreement with University of Oxford for them to provide us with vaccine. So this particular study is in no way sort of under the stewardship of AstraZeneca. So they sort of got observer status in terms of hearing what's happening with the study because they've got observers on the DSMB, but they've got no other, they don't play any role in the South African study. They do play a role in terms of the study in Brazil, and they do play a role in terms of the study in the United States. The agreement between University of Oxford and AstraZeneca in terms of the IP rights around the study is multifold, but the key part of it is that at least during the pandemic period, that this vaccine will be made available at sort of cost of production. Which basically means at no profit for AstraZeneca, at least for the period duration of the pandemic. In addition to which, AstraZeneca is also partnering with other manufacturers in low middle income countries and specifically with Serum Institute in India for them to actually produce vaccine as well. Because there's no company in the world that's going to set up a facility to produce billions of doses of vaccine for 2 years and then those facilities become white elephants because you're probably going to need to have millions of doses moving forward. So basically the entire model around which these vaccines are going to be produced is really being dealt with at multiple fronts. So this vaccine as well as other vaccines, there's another initiative by Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, known as COVAX, together with CEPI. So governments are basically being afforded the opportunity to buy into vaccines and we don't even know which vaccines it is, or at least to ask for assistance to be able to acquire vaccines. So that COVAX initiative has started as of last week, and I know South Africa has already sort of put its hand up in terms of wanting to access vaccines through that particular initiative. So hopefully I've answered your question. In terms of AstraZeneca's sort of obligation to provide vaccine to South Africa, there is none, and I'll be honest about it because this doesn't form part of the AstraZeneca sort of portfolio. In fact, at one stage, AstraZeneca were probably quite keen for the South African study not to go ahead because it doesn't form part of their clinical development plan. But there was pushback against that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question that we've received is the speed by which these trials are implemented might suggest a compromise on ethical processes like informed consent that should be informed by adequate community engagement. We note this is a lacking feature given the speed. How can we as civil society contribute to ensure accountability and rigor in the research process? And it also ties into another question really linked to what we've seen as advocates across the country and indeed across the world, where there's this rush under the guise of it's a pandemic, people are dying, we need answers. And what we're increasingly seeing as advocates and communities is that community rights and the rights of communities to engage and understand the research that is happening in their own backyard are very often sidelined. So could you speak a bit to your views on these speedy approvals that SAPRA is, the fast track, I believe is the term they used, the fast track approvals that SAPRA is giving to this research, and how you think, if at all, it impacts the accountability and rigor of the trial?
Yeah. So I think those are really important questions, and I think we need to just clarify why SAPRA has been able to do sort of fast tracks, and that is because they've put everything else on the back burner in terms of the other applications that were coming forward. So it's not to say that the rigor in terms of the interrogation of the protocols and the ethics and the science is any less. All they've done is that they've basically, rather than taking 4 weeks to basically have a protocol reviewed, because the reviewers are basically looking at multiple different protocols, they're limiting their reviews to COVID-19 protocols, and they're putting everything else, much else on the back burner. And that's really what allowed them to free up the time and space to get this done over a relatively short period of time. With SAPRA as an example, is not to say that they actually approved our first protocol. I think I did share with you a slide in terms of when we submitted. We submitted, I think, on the 9th of May, and we only finally received the approval on the 15th of June. And that was after 2 rounds of comments that we had to respond to in terms of from the reviewers, and as well as changes that they were requesting, and the same thing for the ethics committee. So this is not just going through a sort of rubber stamping process, it's going through adequate interrogation in terms of the science, in terms of the ethics. But the only thing that allows both the ethics committee as well as SAPRA to basically turn it around as quickly as they're doing is, again, that they've put everything else on a back burner and they're prioritizing COVID studies. So in terms of community engagement, so I fully agree with you. I mean, and it's just not about research, it's also about COVID more broadly. Maybe the biggest pitfall in terms of South Africa's response to the COVID-19 crisis and outbreak has been, as an example, not engaging with behavioral scientists at an early stage. Because what we're experiencing now in terms of non-adherence to non-pharmaceutical interventions is simply because the scientists are not great in terms of getting messaging out to the communities. So we need, or at least not a medical scientist. So we need other categories of skill to be able to assist in that process. So I don't think it's unique for the clinical trials. It's something that's actually much more general to COVID-19. People still don't have a good understanding in terms of the virus, what their risk is, how even if they're at low risk, they still pose a risk to others by being reckless about not adhering to non-pharmaceutical interventions. So, I mean, we would welcome any, like I said, we've sort of engaged with the community advisory boards. I don't think it's sufficient. It represents a certain group of people that we sort of engage with on a regular basis. But at the same time, we need to understand that any delay in terms of clinical development of a vaccine, of therapeutics, is putting lives on the line. And that's essential. The pandemic is not going to wait for us to basically check all our boxes before we move ahead. So it's a balance in terms of risk and benefit. And right now, there's a clear benefit to bringing this pandemic to a halt, not just in South Africa, but globally, because it's impacting on people dying from COVID-19, it's impacting on people dying from non-COVID-19 diseases. It's destroying economies, which are not going to take 5 months to recover, which are going to take 5 to 10 years to recover. So it can't be business as usual, but that's not an excuse not to engage with communities. And somehow we need to develop the structures where we're getting different groups within or different expertise to assist in terms of that engagement. Like I said, unfortunately, I don't think scientists such as myself are very good at it.
Thanks, Shabir. A last question from the pre-submitted bunch before we go into the ones that have been submitted now. So we're aware about confidentiality of participation and protection of participants in trials. It seems like this particular trial went a step further by having the trial conducted in unspecified locations, according to media reports. What motivated this, and what could be the unintended outcomes of this approach?
So I'm not too sure it's unidentified places. I mean, we're doing the study.
I think the question is speaking to, are your sites public? Are the details of the sites where this trial is happening public?
Well, whoever is wanting to join the study, all they need to do is call the number and they will be told which site to go to. So anyone can actually phone that number to find out where it is. So the sites are in Soweto, it's in Swanee, and it's in Hillbrow right now. And then we're planning to open up a site in Stellenbosch and in Cape Town next week. So that's where the sites are.
Thanks. Shabir, I just want to cover some few questions that have been submitted. A question from Yvette Raphael: are people dying with or of COVID-19? And based on your answer then, how are we attributing these deaths to COVID, or how are we classifying these deaths to COVID?
Right. So it's a much more complex question than it sounds probably. So the short answer is that amongst the adults that are being diagnosed in hospital, where we're testing them because they're presenting with a clinical illness that's suggestive of COVID-19. And the death in those individuals is highly likely due to COVID-19. So that's in adults. But then, as an example, in children, if a child is born prematurely, as an example, and that was sort of the first death that occurred, That child was born to a mother that was infected with the virus. The child was born and then the child died, but the child died from complications of the preterm delivery, which had nothing to do with COVID. So the child died because of immature lungs, which is very common in children that are born prematurely. But that child was being nursed by a mother that was infected, and they tested the child, and the child also tested positive. But that doesn't mean that the child died from COVID. The child died of something else and not from COVID. So like I said, it's a bit of a difficult question I need time to expand on it. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is that for a majority of adults that are being tested when they're hospitalized, they're being tested because they're suspected of having a disease that's consistent with COVID, and those deaths are very likely to be COVID related. But someone that's like I mentioned, about 20% of people that came to volunteer for the study, when we tested them, they ended up testing positive for the virus, but they were completely asymptomatic, which is not unusual because we know that 2 out of every 3 people that are infected with the virus will be completely asymptomatic. So that's not unusual. But if someone goes and is in a car accident and suffers head trauma from the car accident, and if they come to the hospital, for some reason they decide they're going to take them to surgery, let's do a test first. And if they find a virus in that person, it doesn't mean that that person died from COVID-19. If that person dies, that the cause of death in that person will be the head injury, as an example. So it's not a straightforward answer, but like I said, it's very much dependent. But the type of reports that are being reported by Department of Health, at least for the adults, those are people that have actually died from COVID-19.
Thank you. And just a note to colleagues on the call is that because of time, we obviously cannot go into great detail, but both the VAG and the African Alliance is committing that in the report that you will receive after this call, we will work with the study team to get detailed responses to all of the questions, including the ones you've submitted. Shabir, a question on the chat says, how was the age group selected, and what was the criteria for you setting the ages that you have?
Right. So initially we actually had planned on doing 18 to 55 years of age, and then after SAPRA reviewed and the ethics committee reviewed asked us to revise it up to 65 years of age. And the reason why we limited, so obviously the reason why we got it from 18 years is that people need to be of legal age to be able to consent for participation in the study. And we know that COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting adults compared to young children. So it's essential that we first figure out something for the adult population. The reason for having the upper limit is that beyond 65 years of age, there are problems in terms of the likelihood of them having greater comorbidities, as well as we're uncertain about their immune responses. That is not to say the vaccine is not being evaluated in people over the age of 65. In the United Kingdom, they've got studies underway in parallel with their main study, where they're also enrolling individuals over the age of 65 and over the age of 70. So the vaccine is being evaluated in other settings, in other age groups. But for South Africa, as a first proof of principle, we're wanting to target an age group where we're hoping the vaccine will work and will constitute the majority of the adult population in any case.
Thank you. A question from Keribone Mdolo from Denosa. She says, there's a study that has shown that antibodies are reduced after 3 months. Why are we thinking about herd immunity when we are not, I'm just paraphrasing, when we are not sure yet that those who have recovered won't be infected in the future?
So I think that's a really important comment. And so it is true that in fact, mild and asymptomatic infection is even more pessimistic in that after mild or asymptomatic infection, those antibodies only last for about a month. With more severe illness, it lasts for about 3 months. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other components of the immune system that haven't also been primed to be able to provide immunity. But antibody is at least one of 2 important metrics that we basically look at. So with natural infection, it's possible, and there's a lot of concern that with natural infection, it is possible that you won't achieve herd immunity. But a vaccine is not a natural infection. A vaccine has got a number of advantages over a natural infection in that you're basically giving a much more controlled amount of the antigen. You're basically enhancing the ability of the immune system to basically respond to those antigens. And what you're able to induce is you're likely able to induce much longer lasting immunity, as well as what we call memory responses from a vaccine that might occur from natural infection. So when I'm talking of herd immunity, it's very true that with natural infection, we might not actually achieve herd immunity at any stage, which makes it all the more important to be able to have a vaccine, or else this sort of outbreak will be perpetual in terms of waves of outbreaks for decades to come. So something needs to happen that allows us to, this is not HIV, remember. HIV is a certain type of transmission that takes place that you can pretty much control. For respiratory pathogens, you can't control the type of transmission that takes place as you can for HIV. So what we're hoping to achieve with a vaccine, as I mentioned, is in addition to direct protection, for there to be long-lasting immunity that's induced that will then eventually result in herd immunity.
Thanks, Shabir. A question here, where is the DSMB for this trial sitting, and what is the South African representation on that DSMB?
Yeah. So the DSMB is made up of people both from mainly from the United Kingdom, but including one person from Kenya and one person from South Africa. So this study, they're planning on doing a smaller study of the same vaccine in Kenya. So there's a member from Kenya. In South Africa, the member of the DSMB, I'm sure I can make his name known, is Prof. Greg Hussey, who's retired from UCT, and he's had a long history in terms of vaccines.
Thanks. So, Shabir, you've spoken quite at length about the work that you've done to essentially bring this trial to South Africa in terms of funding and securing the various commitments needed. What is your personal motivation for taking up that mantle, firstly? And then secondly, what has our government's interest been beyond your interest in conducting the trial? So your personal motivation, and then what is government-specific interest?
Okay, so my personal motivation stems from, this is what I've been doing for the past 25 years. So my name has probably only made the media recently, but my greater contribution to science and to the country and to Africa has been the work we've done on vaccine, clinical development of vaccines against pneumonia and diarrheal disease in children, and specifically the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and rotavirus vaccines. And those were also the first vaccines in low middle income countries, including on the African continent, to show that we could protect children from dying from pneumonia and diarrheal disease by vaccinating them. So those clinical trials were actually done in Soweto at my research unit over the past 25 years. And those studies basically informed WHO policy in terms of the introduction of those vaccines globally, especially in low middle income countries. It was because of the studies that were done in South Africa. Each year, those two vaccines alone saves about 500,000 children, including 7,000 children in South Africa from dying, just because those vaccines have been introduced into the public immunization program. So that is really my motivation for looking at vaccines. I've basically done it for the past 25 years. I've seen the impact it's had in terms of improving lives of children, in terms of saving lives of children. And what we're faced with now is a crisis which is basically amenable to vaccine as being the intervention that's going to break the back of this pandemic. My field of expertise is on respiratory pathogens, which is what I've been studying for the past 25 years. So that's my motivation. The reason I ended up with the United Kingdom is I've known the principal investigator for the study in the United Kingdom for roughly about 24 years as well. We attended the same course on vaccinology 24 years ago. And that's the way I know him from, and we've kept in touch. We do sort of similar work. So that was my reason for bringing this. Now, what we need to understand, and I mentioned this during the talk, is that for many life-saving vaccines, it's taken between 5 to 20 years from the time when it becomes available in high-income countries compared to when it becomes available in low-middle-income countries, including in South Africa. There's a huge lag. And often the reason for that lag is because there isn't adequate information in terms of the epidemiology, as well as there isn't evidence that those vaccines would work as well in our local context. So we end up sort of playing catch up all the time, that after the vaccines have been around for 5 years, that's when we start doing the vaccine studies. And then it takes another 5 years before we generate the evidence to get it introduced into the country and into Africa. And we need to short circuit that. We need to be right at the front, making sure that we do the studies at the same time when the studies are being done in high income countries, not 5 years later, not after the pandemic has passed. And that is what happened with the swine flu vaccine in 2009. That vaccine, the swine flu pandemic, the vaccine only became available in South Africa after the pandemic had passed, because South Africa was simply not involved in terms of the clinical development of that vaccine. And we can't afford for that to happen this time around and over again in the future.
Thanks, Shabir. So we're going to there's a lot of questions in the chat, which we are going to address in writing in the report, including your opinions on the BCG vaccine trial. You spoke about the folks who tested positive and they were referred into care. What was that care, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll certainly be in touch in the next few days to flesh out those issues. I have two questions for you before we close. What other current or upcoming vaccine or treatment trial gives you the most hope, apart, of course, from your own?
Yeah, so I think in terms of vaccines, we're hoping that there's another vaccine which has shown really good immune responses, both in the non-human primates as well as in adults. And hopefully those two vaccines will also go into phase 2, phase 3 studies very soon. In particular, there's a vaccine known as the AD26 vaccine. There are the gene-based vaccines, which are being evaluated in the US at the moment. I wasn't too impressed. They just released the data yesterday. I wasn't too impressed with the immune responses. But for the other vaccines, a nanoparticle vaccine, which is a subunit vaccine, that seems to be promising. And there's another vector-based vaccine, which also seems to be promising, what is known as the AD26 vector-based vaccine. In terms of therapeutics, unfortunately, probably the most promising therapeutic, and we don't know exactly what category of patient it would work for, is the monoclonal antibodies. So that's sort of a passive immunization. But we don't know whether it would actually work for people with severe disease or whether it's something that can be used to prevent people from getting infected at least for 4 to 6 months. So monoclonal antibodies is being used in children as an example to protect children from a virus known as RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, but it usually only confers protection for about 3 to 4 months. And some of them need to be given monthly. But in terms of therapeutics, I don't see anything that's sort of standing out there as being the promising intervention right now, other than what's already available to us.
Perfect. Thanks, Shabir. I think we're about to approach the top of the hour. So a last parting question. What is the top lesson that you have learned so far, or the top learning that you have taken away from this experience so far? And finally, what message would you like to leave civil society and advocates with?
Yeah, I mean, my top message is I've never experienced as much difficulty in terms of conducting a vaccine study. This is about the 20th vaccine study for a 20th different vaccine that I've been evaluating over the past 25 years. And this has simply been the toughest for a number of reasons, including just how much people are infected with this virus. It's just causing chaos in terms of being able to adequately sort of design a study to get the type of answers that we're actually requiring of this vaccine. And like I said, at the end of the day, I think it's just an obligation on our part to understand that if we do not get involved in these studies right now, we are going to suffer the consequences in that there's going to be an additional leg over and above what's already probably coming our way in terms of having access to these vaccines in the medium term.
Great. So Shabir, thank you for making the time. It is 11 o'clock. And we look forward to a continuing engagement with yourself and your team, and continuing the relationships we've had also with Karishma and Claire to ensure that the information around this trial gets to communities and civil societies in the most transparent and accountable way possible. So we will follow up this call with the report from the call, and we look forward to further engagements. Thank you, colleagues who have joined us for this hour, our very first webinar. I think as a collective, we're very excited, and really excited that Shabir could have joined us for this first webinar. So thank you again, Shabir, for your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.